So welcome everyone to the 2021 edition of Map the System and to this MRU Campus Final, where we will be celebrating and hearing from 4 teams of students under a systems thinking approach to deepen their understanding of an important and complex social challenge. I'm James Stotch, Director of the Institute for Community Prosperity at MRU, and we're proud to host Map the System for a 5th year running. And what a year it has been. So in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Yarhe Nakota and the Tsuut'ina Nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, play, and learn on this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. So please note that this event is being recorded. Everyone is asked to please keep your mics muted to minimize background noise for presenters. It's always nice to see human faces, reactions, and so on. But of course, it's not a requirement, so feel free to turn your video on or off as you wish. I know we're all Zooming for more than nature intended this year. We're fortunate to have 2 guests with us sharing a few opening words about Map the System. But before I introduce them, I want to thank a few people who made this program and today's event possible. First up, Ashley Metz, the campus coordinator of Map the System. Ashley is a 2020 Bachelor of Communications graduate in the Information Design program. This program would not be possible on MRU's campus without Ashley's leadership. So thank you, Ashley. Dr. Catherine McGowan, Professor of Social Innovation, and Anna Johnson of Ashoka Canada for helping prepare students and mentor them by facilitating a series of workshops. Also, I want to thank Julia Kaiser, 4th year public relations student, and Julia Thiessen from MRU Marketing and Communications for helping to promote the event. This competition rolls up to a 2nd stage Canada-wide competition, which the Institute for Community Prosperity, led by our colleague Latasha Kaffrobe, also manages. So Map the System at this national level is made possible through the support of the McConnell Foundation and the Tricode Charitable Foundation. I've included in the chat just a link to Map the System Canada in case you're interested in seeing the other teams, the other schools in competition, as well as just learning more about what Map the System is all about. So I also want to thank all of the student teams who've worked so hard to prepare their final presentations you will see today. To put it mildly, this year has been a difficult one for post-secondary students all around the world. It is remarkable that these students have persevered with their research and systems mapping, which, by the way, they don't get either credit or cash for. I honor your passion for this important work and your grit and determination in getting to this point. So bringing greetings on behalf of MRU President Tim Raleigh, Provost Elizabeth Evans, and the deans of the various faculties, I'm honored to introduce Brian Traynor, Acting Dean of the Faculty of Business and Communication Studies. Brian is an associate professor in the Information Design program and has been a major champion and supporter of Map the System on campus. So Brian, over to you.
Thanks, James, for a lovely introduction, and thank you for everything that you and Ashley have been doing to support us and to continue to do things like this during these significantly harder times. So it gives me great pleasure to attend and recognize this wonderful event. It's an annual event hosted by the Institute of Community Prosperity. I think this fits the activity, it fits like a glove between the Institute and MRU students. It's like putting on that familiar glove. Map the Systems is a little bit different from other student case competitions or hackathons. Rather than being presented with a defined problem, Students from all academic disciplines explore a systemic, social, or environmental issue that they care about. They present their findings to peers and community members. Students examine these complex issues rather than jump to solutions. They assess the interconnectedness between and actors, interdependencies between individuals, organizations, policies, culture. They develop these multiple points of view and present them as system maps as a way for us to tease out and encourage discussion. The Map to Systems program started with the Skoll Center at Social Entrepreneurship at the University of Oxford. And they host a global final competition, usually in August. And we know it's August because we've had some members of Mount Royal present in Oxford. We've had incredible success at Mount Royal with our student teams, locally, nationally, competing internationally. And our graduate students are competing against students at top universities. Why did they do this? Well, it's because of the motivation that they are self-motivated. They're collaborative students who participate in these activities, but they're citizens of the world, and the questions that they look at are complex and challenging. So we're really proud of the students, all students who participate in this activity. Systems thinking itself is an important skill set. We see it applied in many environments. Governments especially have invested significantly to transform how they deliver resources to communities, establish policies, but what are the intervention methods that are needed to help improve our lives? So these skill sets are also incredibly important to industry and corporate leaders. They're always on the lookout for students who can navigate complex issues such as business transformation or global competition. So these skills that our students are picking up are the skills of the future, and you're almost future-proofing the way in which you're, as you leave Mount Royal and move on, these skills will stay with you. And I hope that this year's theme of Systems Reset is appropriate because this is another year of such change. Over the years of Mapped the Systems, we've seen participation from students across all disciplines. I believe this year we have 16 participating institutions across Canada with 111 teams. So you'll see that this is stage one, and we'll build on to the next cross-Canada activity. For Map the Systems, we've been doing this, I think, for 5 years now, as James mentioned. We finished, Mount Royal has finished in the top 6 3 times and globally. And in 2018, Roisin Dillon won with a presentation around the opioid crisis in Canada. So no pressure, anybody here presenting today. I'm so pleased to have been invited for the presentation. I'd like to congratulate all teams in advance for the work that they've done. I believe Map to Systems should be considered a transformative learning experience for students. And I hope you'll have fond memories of the competition when you look back at your time at Mount Royal University. I was really pleased to see James acknowledge the funding sources. So that's excellent, James. Thank you. But I would like to just give one more shout out to James and Ashley for the leadership and mentorship that they've provided to everyone in this program, and to Catherine McGowan for the work that she's done to help these teams too. So thanks, everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing the presentations.
Whoops, just realized I'm on mute. Thank you, Brian. Many of you joining this event for the first time might be wondering what the heck is Map the System exactly? And you know, Brian gave a great overview of it, and to provide a first-hand mentor educator's perspective on Map the System, because she runs a class actually tied to it, is Dr. Catherine McGowan. So Dr. McGowan is a assistant professor of social innovation, but also a historian. a veritable walking encyclopedia of complex societal challenges throughout history and the innovative ways in which humanity has addressed these challenges, including inspiring successes and failures rich with insight. So for those of us who are no longer undergrads and haven't been for many, many years, Dr. McGowan is really the type of professor that makes us wish we were undergrads again. So Catherine, over to you.
Wow, James, that's I'm actually made a little uncomfortable, so I want to thank you for that. Now, my colleagues have done a really good job of describing sort of the ins and outs of Map the System, but before we jump into this, to give the people on the call who are not participants and not judges a sense of the exceptional work and achievement that these teams have brought to us today, I want to sort of give you a sense of the logic of Map the System. And I also want to emphasize something as well. Canada is the most competitive and challenging place to be a Map the System participant. We are the only place in the world that has a national level competition. Everywhere else, you go from school to Oxford right away. And so the success that Mount Royal has had and continues to have is an indication of how hard these students work and how much they are committed to developing these skills. Now, what skills are we talking about? Well, intuitively, we often understand that the world is complex. And you see it in our language. We'll say stuff like, oh, that's really messy. You see it in how we critique political decisions, or how we sort of even evaluate our own lives. And you especially see it right now in COVID, where we are understanding in a visceral and often much more immediate way how systems around us can either elevate or potentially fail us when a crisis comes in. And so the question is, how do we translate that intuitive understanding of complexity into decision-making in the for-profit, not-for-profit, government, and everything in between sectors when these students go on to graduate and become change makers themselves? And Map the System is one set of tools that is meant to help them do that, help them translate that intuitive understanding of complexity into something more useful and more helpful. And so ultimately what we expect students to do is to pick a problem that they're passionate about. Sometimes it's something they have experienced viscerally, and in other cases, it's something that is completely sort of separate from their lives, but that they care about deeply. And they spend essentially 95% of their time trying to understand that problem. And this is not research in the classic sense of things. They're not sort of testing a hypothesis, but instead what they're trying to do is knit together the different experiences from a quantitative and qualitative perspective from different disciplines, and ultimately as well, the experiential element. So how does it feel to go through this? How does this understood? And then from that information, they try to be able to actually just sort of evaluate certain, sorry, I'm getting someone's at the door, of course. So from, this isn't complexity, this is just chaos. And I think we can all experience that these days. From that deep understanding, they then sort of go on to evaluate both extant solutions and possible solutions, so that going forward, they can act as agents of social change and not social engineers, so that they can act with humility and knowledge. So this to me is not a classic research competition, nor is it a classic pitch competition. Instead, it walks that very fine line between wanting to learn and wanting to practice, wanting to engage and wanting to sort of reflect. And that's why, to me at least, I feel that these are key 21st century skills that will equip and can have equipped our graduates to go forward and make change regardless of what the problem is. It's the skill set of having reflection, humility, and engagement. And that to me is perhaps the most valuable thing we can give our students. And in fact, what you're going to see from our 4 amazing teams is just that combination of humility, action, and reflection. To be honest, I think they've surpassed what any one class can do. So I am humbled by being part of their engagement, and I'm very much excited to see what they do. And I wish them all the best of luck.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And finally, before we get to the student presentations, I want to thank and introduce our 4 esteemed judges. So our judges hail from the broader campus community and the broader community. Steve, George, Yasmin, and Nicole. Nicole Croft is the manager of systems mapping at Help Seeker, a Calgary-based B Corp certified enterprise operating at the intersection of technological and social innovation, focused on digital solutions for the world's social challenges. Nicole oversees the daily operations of system mapping activities, including research, data entry, quality assurance, and customer service for both the Help Seeker platform and their navigation apps. Nicole is also an MRU alumnus with a BA in sociology and a diploma in early childhood education and development. With a special interest in social inequality, urban poverty, and research, Nicole leads a team of systems mapping analysts that span geographically from Alberta to New Brunswick. Currently, her work involves creating a comprehensive systems map of all the community and social services available to over 5,000 cities across Canada. George Constantinescu. George is Senior Vice President and Chief Transformation Officer with ATCO Limited, a global leader in integrated energy and infrastructure solutions. In this role, Mr. Contanescu is responsible for leading transformation initiatives that enable innovation and growth across the enterprise and advancing new commercial initiatives around the world. George played a pivotal role in establishing ATCO's international electricity generation operations in Australia, as well as evaluating opportunities both in the United Kingdom and the United States. In 2002, he joined ATCO's corporate office as Senior Manager Corporate Development, where he was an instrumental member of the team that successfully led the strategic divestiture of ATCO's retail energy operations. George graduated from the University of Alberta with a BSc in electrical engineering. Steve Kootenay-Jobin. Steve Kootenay-Jobin is Yarhe Nakota from Stoney Nation in Treaty 7 territory. His traditional name is Natoya Pikski, which translates to Holy Bird in Blackfoot. And apologies, Steve, if I've butchered that. Steve is proud to be two-spirited and is married to his partner, Juan. For the last 6.5 years, Steve has worked in the Niskim Center at MRU at the Indigenous Housing and Events as the Indigenous Housing and Events Coordinator. Prior to this, Steve was an MRU student where he completed the Aboriginal Education Program, Arts and Science Diploma, and Bachelor of Arts in Sociology. Steve is entering his final year of studies in the Master of Education Interdisciplinary Studies program at the University of Calgary. In 2019, Steve was the recipient of the City of Calgary Chief David Crowchild Memorial Award for his leadership in the Indigenous urban community. He was featured on CTV as an inspiring Albertan in 2018 and was on the Walking with Our Sisters campaign that raised awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Steve's passion he has followed throughout his life, education, and career has been on improving race relations and addressing inequalities and inequities of underrepresented groups. Dr. Yasmin Dean is an Associate Professor of Social Work, Chair of the Department of Child Studies and Social Work, and a Senior Research Fellow with the Institute for Community Prosperity. Amplifying voices to end all forms of social injustice is a personal and professional lifelong commitment for Dr. Dean. Her interests focus on the decolonization of social work education, design and delivery of international education, mentorship, and development of undergraduate student researchers and community engagement. Current research includes analysis of post-secondary academic leadership and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Yasmin serves as a mentor in our Catamount Fellowship program as well. So we will have a 10-minute presentation from each of the 4 student teams, each one followed by 5 minutes of Q&A from the judges. Once all the teams have presented, the judges will leave us to deliberate in their own virtual chat room. While this is happening, we'll have a short virtual fireside chat with 2 students from last year's winning team. The judges will then return to announce the winner. So please note as well, the judges have already reviewed each of the 4 teams' written submissions, which is the majority of the evaluation in their overall scores. So while the presentations here will factor into their decisions, there is much more to consider behind the scenes. Each of the winning teams have already submitted a research paper, a bibliography, a visual map of the systems they're describing, and the social challenge they're examining. So first up, examining the issue of mental load of mothers. Julia Kaiser, fourth year public relations student, and Roshni McCartney, second year general management student with a social innovation concentration.
Hello, thank you for your time, and thank you to both the Institute and the judges for taking the time to watch our presentation. Let's get started. March 20th, 2020. The living room has fallen and the coffee is flowing. I have 2 papers due tomorrow and no idea what to make for dinner. Have you ever thought about the process of making dinner? Over the last year, meals have been a constant source of struggle for me and thought. And I'd like to share a little bit about why. In March 2020, over the span of 3 days, we suffered a global landscape level shock. In Calgary, schools, workplaces, childcare facilities, playgrounds, and other indoor spaces were closed. My daughter turns 5 the same day a public health emergency was declared. I was hooked to the news because every new update felt like a blow to the lives that we thought we were living. And I suddenly had to make dinner, and 3 meals a day for 3 people because children like to eat daily. It felt like an unrelenting pressure to make sure what we were eating was healthy, delicious, and quick, because I was still a full-time student as well. I have a child who has a moral objection to every vegetable he's ever met, and another who only has a passing acquaintance with a spoon. It was a difficult time. So I'd like to share a little bit of what my mental load looks like when I'm making dinner. It's everything from laundry, dishes, work deadlines, report cards, everything. Everything is on my mind. And it's a big problem, and it's not just mine. You see, the mental load is kind of like this never-ending to-do list inside your head regarding domestic life. It's all the things we do to keep a household running. It's also known as worry work, domestic labor, or invisible labor. It's the thinking, the planning, and the organizing of household activities. And it involves everything. It's hard to address because it's a social problem, but also very personal. We've allowed it to get to the point where women feel as though they're obligated to perform these domestic duties and guilty when they don't meet a societal expectation. So how did it start? Well, historically, women have been in the workplace for a long time. But in our modern day, this started somewhere around the First World War, when women entered the workforce while men went off to fight. We changed the ways our societies worked, but we didn't adapt our households to meet those needs. Our research pulled out 3 specific levels regarding career management, education and childcare, and mental health. They all place unique pressures on women, and I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into all 3 of these. Let's start with career management. Women struggle in the workplace. They can be seen as unreliable and non-committal when it comes to caring for children. They may need to leave early or take time off to care for their own children. And in the case of academia, female academics saw a significant decline in their research output in 2020 as compared to men who saw an increase because of all the other duties they were taking on in addition to their work, which ties into my next point of education and childcare. You see, Canadian women are spending 2.5 times the amount of time on childcare than Canadian men. This is on top of their work duties. They are taking care of their children's education from home, and they're watching them because daycares are at home. This leads to mental health problems because women have taken on increased childcare responsibilities and therefore have worse mental health outcomes. They feel as though they're failing themselves, their families, and their workplaces. And they feel anxious and depressed about the state of the world, overwhelmed, exhausted. They've lost their support networks, which brings us to September of 2020. I wish I could send my kids back to school, but it doesn't feel safe. I don't know how to juggle everything though. I wrote this, but I'm not the only person who feels this way. I'm going to pass it on to Julia now to share a little bit more about what we learned.
Thanks, Roshni. Our current system shifts the burden of displeasure to women. They must speak up and ask for help, but sometimes risk being labeled a nag or a downer. The interesting thing is our research found that men were open to helping with domestic labor and that their female partners just need to ask. The gap here is that women don't want to ask. They want their partner to take initiative and own part of the mental load. That's what led us to our 3 gaps. Number 1, how might we change ideas of domestic labor? Number 2, how might we create a cultural shift around ideas of mental health and the mental load? And finally, how might we encourage a dialogue between men and women about household labor? As we navigated potential levers of change in lightening the mental load for mothers, 3 important themes continue to surface. This includes the UN sustainability goals, social solutions, and government solutions. It's our belief that each have a necessary role in closing the identified gaps if they all work together. Unpaid labor has been addressed by point 5.4 in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. If we could create a cultural shift that values the work of the home, the pressure mothers feel to handle everything could decrease and create more balanced households. Cultural shifts are difficult as they require buy-ins from many people, many of whom are just as happy with the status quo. Working through an internationally recognized organization such as the UN is a benefit, as the same name recognition will allow people to take the message seriously. Knowledge of the mental load is slowly increasing in popular culture. This includes a French comic named You Should Have Asked and a striking article from the Huffington Post called She Divorced Me Because I Left Dishes by the Sink. The real way to tackle the idea of the mental load as we know it and open up the dialogue in families is by bringing it up in our own circles. It's easy to turn a blind eye to the mental load that mothers face, especially when you're not a mother, much like myself. Carrying the mental load is a conversation that should be had between couples, similarly as they do about children and marriage, to avoid resentment and potentially divorce, like the Huffington Post article went into. As a public relations student, it's easy for me to talk about social media as another place to keep the conversation going. Whether it's between other mothers feeling the same pressures or speaking about your own experience with friends and family, it's a tool that can work fast to break down the stigma. This is an issue impacting millions of women across the country, and there's no need for them to feel isolated. Not only does social media support Gap 1, the idea of domestic labor, and Gap 2, mental health and the mental load, but it can also help bridge the conversation with families, overall making it a crucial lever of change. In an unprecedented divorce case in China, a woman was granted the equivalent to $7,000 US for the house duties that she completed during the marriage. In Canada, the Persons case of 1929, Edwards v. Canada, was the result of similar pressure to change societal norms and help create a more equal society. Cases such as these create a shift in how domestic work is seen and create legal precedents for the future. In returning to our first gap, which asks how we might change the idea of domestic labor, government support is an important lever. One way to combat this is to put an actual monetary value on the mental load, to say that household tasks are just as important as paid work. This could be done by allowing for more equitable parental leave policies or creating a stay-at-home parent benefit. This can be further extended to mental health services to ensure the healthcare system has the tools that they need to support mothers falling under the mental load. As outlined in Gap 2, the cultural shift around mental health and the mental load needs to be changed. By investing resources into the healthcare system that specifically target this demographic, the system has the potential to evolve. I will now pass things back to Roshni.
This began as one mother's desire to reach out to others in the same situation and has developed into an in-depth consideration of how mental models of domestic duty have been reinforced by societal structures. I'd like to share with you some of our insights. Well, we learned there's an unbearable pressure to perform, both in the workplace and at home. We also learned this is not just a family problem, it's societal. As Julia mentioned, it affects millions of women across Canada. And finally, women are taking on the burden of domestic labor, but there are some shifts towards changing the system. Bringing us to today, April 2021. When will this end? The last year feels like 10, and I'm not doing well. How about you? I know I need to go figure out dinner, but to be honest, I think I'm just going to order a pizza and maybe add a salad so I feel like a good mom. Thank you again for your time.
So thank you so much, Julia and Roshni. We have now 5 minutes for questions and answer from the judges. Questions from the judges.
Thank you, Roshni and Julia, for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I guess I just had a question around sort of societal viewpoints and why you made the choice to focus specifically on gender and didn't look at sort of other family structures, I suppose. In particular, I guess I'm asking the question of, you went straight to mothers, to women, to she, her pronouns, but nowhere in the presentation did you invite the idea of other family structures. And I was just a little bit curious about that.
So I'll take this one, Julia, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
The reason I leaned towards that was the amount of literature and articles are primarily focused on mothers and male-female relationships. In our paper, we did acknowledge there are many other different gender identities and relationships and family organizations. However, there just isn't a lot of literature there. To make the paper a lot stronger, we wanted to focus on what was there. That is a really interesting area for further consideration.
Thank you very much. That's helpful.
Excellent presentation. I have a question, if it's all right. You mentioned a few systems involved in government and so on. I'm just wondering about the role of the employer. Is there any, discrepancies between the flexibility they offer to mothers to handle those workloads opposed to, men in the same situation? Or, perhaps the research didn't touch on that.
It didn't, unfortunately. However, something that just popped up recently was that LinkedIn does now offer the stay-at-home parent as an employment option, which I think is a great way of ridding a little bit of that stigma and the employment gap.
Thank you very much.
I just have a little inquiry and wanted some background. I just want to say great job, Roshni and Julia. And I just wanted to know, as you were looking into the backgrounds and what's leading up to these problems, I've also wondered how come you haven't included the economy and also women's role in the economy as well. Because if we're looking historically, and Yasmin brought up a really good point with focusing specifically on female mothers, but we also look at the issue as well, is that the devalue of women within the economy and their roles. We often hear of white collar and blue collar, but we also forget about the pink collar. And women's roles have often been devalued over time, and roles that were once occupied by men are now predominantly filled by females, but with the lower rate of pay that often goes into it, along with juggling the homework as well. Do you feel within your team that if we took a look at the pink collar economy, but also the roles that women have, not only in society, at home, but also within the workforce as well, what role do you think that the economy and the pink collar mentality has on working mothers as well? Because, we're looking at lower rates of pay, you're having more stress onto it as well, not just with childcare and everything, but finances, it continues because we're looking at things like healthcare aides, call service agencies and things like that. Those are predominantly pink collar daycares and things like that, where they're very low rates of pay that I imagine contribute to this huge amount of stress on mothers as well. Does your research tie into any of that and it being a possible solution? Because you're asking for a societal change and the views of the division of home labor, but what about the issues of economy and the pay inequities that exist between females and males within the economy?
That's a great question, Steve. And I think there could honestly be a whole other Map the System project on that because it is massive and really hard to tackle. And I think one of the things that we were worried about was trying to make sure our research was as streamlined as possible, because that was a huge avenue, both that and also looking at what different family structures look like. These are very intimidating and scary to look at. And when we only have 3,000 words and want 10 minutes, we kind of had to decide what was important to us. And ultimately, you know, Roshni's experience really inspired this and what she has gone through over the last year. And I think what we chose to do and how we chose to do it was really fueled in her personal experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the research was there, absolutely 100%. But I feel like we feared that we couldn't give it the time it needed in the project. With both of what both you and Yasmin brought up, is we just didn't want to, you know, lightly touch on it because it's too big. It's too messy, as Catherine said.
So
I don't know if you can add on, Roshni.
I'm gonna cut you off there because we're out of time, but just want to thank you, Roshni and Julia, for highlighting what I think at once is both a sleeper issue and one that I think to many is highly relatable. And also, Roshni, for your courage to talk about your own journey with this issue. So we have to move on to team 2. Thanks so much. Next up, looking at the issue of overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canada's child welfare system. So we have Emma Berger, who's a third-year psychology student, Mizuki Oshida, international student, recent graduate in the social work diploma program. You may remember Mizuki also was a MAP the System participant last year. Vanessa Sandoval, second-year psychology student, and Eloisa Gilham, third-year sociology student.
Hi everyone. Our project is focused on the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the Canadian child welfare system. Before we begin our presentation, we would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot First Nation tribes of Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation tribes of Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3.
As for non-Indigenous students, we will never have to experience the societal and institutionalized violence of Indigenous people. However, we recognize that educating oneself and spreading awareness is a key step in being an ally. Our research is a way for us to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people and activists who are challenging colonial institutions across Turtle Island. We recognize that each community will have different lived experiences and cultural traditions. But to get a wider understanding, we focused on the general pattern across Canada.
Think back to when you were a child. Did you ever go on a surprise road trip and you were so excited because you knew you were going to have the time of your life? But what if instead of your parents in the front seats, it's strangers and you never come back home? They call them foster parents, but you know they're not your real parents. You're scared and lash out at those white-skinned people you were taught to fear, yet you're the one who gets punished. Eventually, you learn that if you act like them, they will accept you. Soon, the calling to rediscover yourself will be too strong to ignore, but your past, language, and culture feel worlds away. You'll be lucky if you ever find your way back home.
This is a historical timeline of the disruption of Indigenous families, starting with the oppressive Indian Act of 1876, which gave the Canadian government full control over Indigenous people. The Indian Act was the first piece of legislation to propose education as a tool for assimilation through the forcible removal of Indigenous children to attend abusive residential schools. In the 40s, residential schools transitioned into operating like orphanages and child welfare programs after the Canadian government acknowledged that expensive residential schools failed to achieve the genocidal results desired. Closure of residential schools began between the 60s and 70s, and Indigenous children were removed from their families by child welfare agencies to non-Indigenous homes, contributing to cultural genocide. These events have increased the number of Indigenous children in care today. Jordan Anderson's death, missing person Bonnie Joseph, Tina Fontaine's murder, and Kanina Sue Turtle's suicide show how the child welfare system causes family disruption through inadequate government funding and accountability, its contribution to the stolen lives of Indigenous women and girls, and high rates of suicide and poor mental health outcomes.
Chronic government underfunding and ongoing effects of colonialism have resulted in Indigenous children constituting 52% of children in care, despite only making up 7.7% of the Canadian child population. The aim to kill the Indian in the child contributed to language and cultural loss. Many Indigenous children suffered various types of abuse, severing family social ties for generations to come. The 60s Scoop continued to remove children from communities and into welfare agencies, repeating the same trauma. This decreased the functionality of parents due to substance abuse and mental illness. By disconnecting Indigenous children from their cultures, child welfare is removing a potential protective factor from their lives.
Government underfunding as a result of the Indian Act has led to inhumane living conditions, such as housing issues, the water crisis, and poverty on reserves. COVID-19 enhances the effect of these poor conditions and contributes to culture loss due to the susceptibility of elders to the virus. Despite parents' inability to control their living conditions, the kids are taken away because colonial assessment tools qualify poor socioeconomic conditions as neglect. Unaddressed physical and mental health issues make it harder for parents to take care of their children, increasing the likelihood of child apprehension. Government-imposed rules and restrictions, lack of access to technology, low literacy rates, and language barriers can make accessing social services nearly impossible. Indigenous peoples have difficulty trusting authority figures due to the frequent discrimination they have endured, and disconnection from their community and traditional healing practices can result in youth turning to drugs to cope.
Child removal results in the parents' decreased mental health, ultimately affecting their parental functionality. This invites child welfare involvement, which can exacerbate interference with Indigenous parenting through westernized parenting assessment and theories that don't fit into the Indigenous families.
Structural oppression is the interactions between societal institutions to reduce social inequality. Employment discrimination can result in the apprehension of children based on low socioeconomic status. Housing discrimination in urban areas results in a higher rate of Indigenous people residing in overcrowded and run-down housing. Children can be apprehended for poor living conditions. Police officers' racist biases contribute to Indigenous children entering care when responding to child maltreatment reports. And the child welfare system interacts with inaccessible health services by apprehending children on the assumption that parents are neglecting their child's health.
Cultural disconnection is prevalent among youth due to non-Indigenous foster families, employment, and educational opportunities of reserves. Another major contributor is the pan-Indigenous approach, in which we fail to recognize the differences among the communities. Disconnection from land results in language loss, which promotes identity loss, contributing to colonization. We have to remember that cultural preservation is pivotal to decolonization. Social work professor Audrey Foggin suggests that connection to the land enables reclamation. Despite adversities experienced due to their Indigenous identities, understanding one's culture can invite them to forgiveness, which acts as healing processes. Survivorship is, after all, cultivated this way. A sense of survivorship further encourages their connection to the culture. The Australian-based risk assessment and safety planning tool, Signs of Safety, is used in Alberta. The beauty of this is strength-based approach. However, it is in accordance with pan-Indigeneity. Bill C-92 recognizes Indigenous self-governance. This unfortunately has brought up the question around the funding sources, which has prevented Indigenous authorities to have full control. Some new forms of housing projects are introduced. Federal funding is also allocated to the housing and water crisis, though a lack of long-term funding is a core issue. Pennsylvania has structured whole community support. Nevertheless, Indigenous services are run by federal and provincial governments. Jordan's principle was enacted to ensure First Nation children's access to necessary services without dispute. However, a lack of funding has been obvious, and Bill C-92 fails to address this gap.
Gaps in lives have changed. The first gap requires inadequate funding of infrastructure that can be resolved through a funding based on a socioeconomic status and updated policies involving the maintenance and operation of new technology. The second gap refers to the collaboration with knowledge keepers. This ensures cultural preservation is integrated in child welfare legislation and social work practices. The third gap is the lack of support for Indigenous jurisdiction over child and family services. There needs to be a long-term funding through quick negotiation of coordination agreements and legal protections. Lastly, the gap is the lack of Indigenous education and research. Universities should develop their curriculum with Indigenous perspectives and require mandatory Indigenous studies classes. Indigenous Services Canada research must be recent for informed decisions on community development.
Lessons. The Canadian government's underfunding and inability to address states of emergency in Indigenous communities is harming them, and this colonial perspective of the child welfare system inadequately evaluates Indigenous parenting practices. To ensure that every Indigenous child can have a good life, we call on the Canadian government to give Indigenous peoples full control of their own child welfare services. Let's imagine Indigenous kids excited about their own futures instead of fearing they won't make it. Indigenous children should be able to grow up at home with their true families, where their culture is celebrated rather than looked down upon, just as other Canadian children do. Because after all, every child has a spirit that longs to go home. On behalf of my team, thank you to all of our interviewees for your lived expertise, to Peter Choate, sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Audra Foggin, Carolyn Gordon, Elder Roy Bearchief, Christina Tortorelli, Elder Doreen Spence, Elder Hayden Melting-Tallow, and Trudy Yellowfly. Your participation was invaluable to our research, and we would also like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to us today. But now we ask you to listen to Indigenous stories and treat them with the respect they deserve.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, Mizuki, Eloisa, and Emma, for highlighting a really urgent decades-long issue that affects every corner of this country. So we have time for 2 questions for sure, possibly a third if we can squeeze it in.
I would like to go first. If that's all right. I just want to say very good job. I think very tied into definitely a lot of the issues that are contributing to this ever-growing number. But the one question that I have is, where is the discussion of systemic racism within this mapping process, but also as well, what role are non-Indigenous peoples going to play in decolonizing the child welfare system? Because as much healing as we need to do as Indigenous peoples from intergenerational trauma, we're not the only ones who need to decolonize. As much as we are colonized as Indigenous peoples, we also have many settlers here who are on this journey with us. You know, and a huge contributing factor of Indigenous children in care, the over-policing, our inadequate access to healthcare, and our experiences within all of these systems is systemic racism. I'm wondering how, if we're looking to address this, as like, I see that as one of the root causes, which I didn't see in your map, but I'm also wondering as well, what role is it that non-Indigenous settler Canadians are going to play in this? Because that's a big part of addressing this issue. We could have as much policies in here, but equality under the law does not equate to equality within society. So I was actually really shocked that I didn't see that as much in your research. I saw that you referenced Turner a bit, and I was also wondering if maybe it was from not being able to speak from an Indigenous voice, if that was why it was a hard time with coining systemic racism, but talking about the root issues that come with it.
I can speak on this. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mizuki.
Okay, so I did actually include a lack of understanding of public in Indigenous understanding and parental styles in my causal loop diagram. And because what I saw was that when Indigenous people moved to a big city like Calgary, they live with other settler Canadians. And then, for example, if this Indigenous individual leaves their children at birth by by themselves, then other non-Indigenous community members think it's neglect or some kind of abuse. So to do that, we non-Indigenous people have to understand that community reeling in Indigenous communities, and it's not just a mother and child relationship, it's more like community reeling. So that's, we have to understand, and we have to be open-minded to learn Indigenous traditional parenting styles.
And I was just going to add that by talking about residential schools and the Indian Act and like just going through the history of how we got to the child welfare system, like that was obviously a very racist history. And I'm sorry if we didn't point that out enough, because we definitely recognize that. And I think a lot of how we presented our information was trying to be respectful to Indigenous perspectives and not necessarily say that we have all the solutions. Like, as non-Indigenous people, we didn't want to be like white saviors or trying to solve a problem that we know that like isn't ours to solve, but we also we recognize that there's things that we need to do on our part, and that just learning about it isn't necessarily enough, but that, you know, we should consistently be trying as people in general just to be like respectful of each other and promote that through our everyday lives.
And if you don't mind, I would like to add something as well. So we did talk a little bit about structural and systemic oppression, but we didn't outright say systemic racism. We did include anti-Indigenous racism within our mental models that are contributing to the problem. If you're talking about the solutions to systemic racism and structural racism, I definitely agree with you. I think we should have gone into more depth research on the solutions to that. The only issue is that I just felt like it was out of our depth in research, and just we couldn't cover it, because I really don't think reform to these systems that are inherently colonial and are continuing to just insert violence into Indigenous people's lives are going to be solved by reforms. I think there needs to be, or even defunding, I think there needs to be a lot more radical approach, and just like looking into how each system would be decolonized was just a lot of research that we just didn't have time to include.
So I hate to be a tyrant, but I'm going to have to cut it off. But thank you, Eloisa, Mizuki, Emma, Vanessa. Really well done. So next up, looking at the issue of intimate partner violence perpetrated against young women in Alberta. We have Joanna Keogh, graduate with a major in health science. Anna Maria, and apologies, Anna Maria, I'm going to butcher your last name. Kioro Gariu Yvonne, graduated with a major in health science. And Mackenzie Kozak, graduated with a major in health science as well. And Abi Mera, graduated with a major in general science. And just as a note, when I say graduated, the Map the System competition is open to not just students, but also first-year graduates. So it's definitely open to very recent graduates. So take it away.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, James. Let's get started. As young women, we all have different experiences and have been impacted directly or indirectly by intimate partner violence. And this is why we feel so compelled to advocate for all women's safety today.
Intimate partner violence can present itself in many forms, but is largely defined as abuse or violence within a past or present romantic relationship and is often control motivated. Although IPV can affect anyone from any demographic, 8 in 10 victims of IPV are women in Canada, and the main perpetrators are largely male. We have chosen to focus our scope on all women that are young adults in Alberta, because 1, a woman is killed every 2.5 days in Canada. 2, because young adult women are at the highest risk of violence. And finally, because Alberta has the 3rd highest numbers of intimate partner violence. Because of the structures and models in place and the multifaceted nature of abuse, Victims often feel like leaving the abuse would result in more severe consequences. So it becomes this cycle that is hard to leave. This issue has only worsened with COVID, as the pandemic has exacerbated women's vulnerabilities and thus their susceptibility to violence. There are 4 distinct categories of IPV, which include physical violence, stalking, sexual violence, and psychological abuse. This isn't an exhaustive list, as there are other subcategories listed in our paper.
So the most important background to highlight is the patriarchy. This will later be discussed in our iceberg model. However, patriarchy acts as a belief system that individuals hold in our society, recognizing men as the dominant power. This socially accepted gender imbalance has been shown to reveal deep roots in IPV. Likewise, patriarchy continues to enable and uphold system structures and form patterns that contribute to violence against women today.
So we have identified vulnerabilities or risk factors that make women more susceptible to IPV. It is important to note that being in a vulnerable category does not mean it is a causation for IPV. So first of all, research shows that women age 18 to 24 experience the highest rates of violence, particularly due to the fact that they are serial daters. Serial daters seek casual, romantic, or sexual connections in which their partners can change often. This has been linked to decreased self-esteem, which is associated with IPV. Financial insecurity is another factor that may lead to financial dependence or lack of sufficient funds to access legal services. These are both barriers to leaving abusive relationships. Women with disabilities often see higher rates of abuse, largely due to the ability for others to take advantage of them. Women who are isolated experience higher rates of violence. This is largely seen in rural and remote areas. Substance abuse has been found to be associated with higher rates of violence and can make circumstances more complicated when trying to leave abuse. And finally, marginalized populations may experience more challenges and barriers to accessing culturally relevant resources. Each of these categories have high correlations to IPV and are categories that young women in Alberta may identify with.
So moving on to the systems thinking approach, we decided to use this iceberg model because intimate partner violence similarly often only shows just the tip of the iceberg. So we need to be able to look at IPV as a whole problem instead of just the events that are obvious. But for the sake of this presentation and time, we're kind of just going to look at the events and the mental models. So for the events, these are the situations that befall victims of IPV. Once again, focusing specifically on young women in Alberta. Naturally, being a victim of violence is a burden in and of itself, but that doesn't even touch on the complexities and the intricacies of what victims actually experience, like the lack of capacity in shelters, or the many barriers faced with deciding to actually leave the abusive relationship. Not to mention COVID-19 pandemic causing even more isolation and even less available in-person resources. And this is just an example of another disaster that leaves women as the casualties of poor disaster planning. For mental models, this is the absolute pinnacle of IPV. These are the issues that are historically embedded in our society, and these issues marginalize women and increase the risk of IPV. But once again, we want to state that although many systemic structures exist to worsen IPV, it is ultimately the abuser who is responsible for this, justified by the patriarchy, which preserves the system to allow men to fall into their illusory merit of dominance over women.
So another way we wanted to model this system was through a scatter map to get at some various connections and interactions in this system. So to walk you through this map, we'll start with the 3 overarching categories that we identified. So these are history and current social norms, government and policy, and inadequate intervention and prevention. So after this, we really wanted this map to be able to isolate specific circumstances or actions that could be as close to leading to IPV as possible. And I say as close to leading to IPV because there is no universal one factor that if this happens, IPV will 100% happen. It's not a problem like that. However, by following these 3 main themes, we were able to identify 5 factors that most closely relate to IPV. These factors surround a woman's ability to safely leave an abusive relationship, as well as factors that might contribute to the abusive situation in the first place. And now, because some of these are actions of the victim, we wanted to clarify that the victims are never the ones responsible for violence. Society allows both men and women to fail in this system,
but ultimately it's the abuser that chooses violence, and that's the only true cause. However, it is helpful to identify these actions most closely related to IPV so that we can work towards proper solutions.
Moving on, here we highlight our solutions landscape with this floral diagram. When you're in a relationship and you've gone through an intense argument with your partner, they may gift you with flowers. However, flowers are not an apology for violence, and women need more supports. This is why we have highlighted an abundance of supports listed above to encourage women to get the help that they need. There are some amazing resources and organizations working to educate and support victims of IPV, but some of them are underfunded and underutilized. We have important stakeholders such as healthcare and service supports, such as social workers, various online resources and call lines, which empower victims and guide them to seek the help that they need. Another progressive support is Clare's Law, which was passed recently, April 1st in Alberta. It enables a person to obtain information about their partner if they feel at risk of domestic violence. And this law stems from the story of Claire Wood, a woman who was murdered in England. This could have been prevented as the police knew him to be dangerous.
For talking about the gaps and levers for change, everything that we will discuss is an element in our larger systems map. And the first thing that we wanted to touch on was government and policy, as we believe that implementing more progressive legal policies, such as Clare's Law, would be a step in the right direction for addressing IPV and can really change women's realities when it comes to leaving abusive relationships. And one thing we wanted to highlight here is the potential to have a defund to fund alternative services for the Calgary Police. So this could look like reducing the police budget and having someone like a social worker go on all calls for domestic violence to make women feel more supported. And something that goes hand in hand with government and policy is number 2, representation. And this is one way to sort of tackle the current inequalities that are existing today so that we can have more women and more equity deserving perspectives in that group to have different perspectives on solutions. Thirdly, we think that making the services that are already available easy to find and all in one spot would go a long way to supporting women. And we think strengthening current supports by making things more cohesive and really involve the community would also be helpful for these women. And we think it's important to develop awareness interventions to start preventing future generations of women from having to experience IPV. And then lastly, to touch on the pandemic, as this has affected women largely in a negative way when it comes to IPV, it's really important that we have a female-oriented disaster prepare plan to make sure that this doesn't become another shadow pandemic in the future.
So for key insights, we think that while we're reflecting and working on this project, we realize it's not only mentally demanding, but incredibly emotionally draining, as the stories of women who survived and those who unfortunately didn't became the martyrs who advanced the fight against IPV and helped us to create this project. So we think it's incredibly important to focus on dismantling the patriarchy, creating comprehensive interventions to prevent IPV, and creating disaster plans with women in mind in order to terminate this pattern of violence. As a group of 4 young women in Alberta ourselves, it's apparent that we're actually in the exact risk group that we're advocating for. So we hope that as we create awareness of this problem, we may also be part of the solution to mitigate the cycle of violence so that no woman has to live in fear. Thank you so much, and we are ready to accept some questions now.
Thank you, Abby, Mackenzie, Anna Maria, and Joanna for bringing our attention to this crucial issue with some really rich insights and new insights as well. Questions?
Hi, great job on your presentation, by the way, really enjoyed it. Couple questions just to do with, you mentioned quite a few times, it's not, in this case, the female's, responsibility, and there's more to it. Is there any, did you find any research to do with, men? There is research out there that suggests, men that are abusing are often there's background to suggest that they also need help themselves, rather than putting this onus on women to, again, reach out and start the conversation. And oftentimes women are removed from those situations. So their whole family structure, their support system, they're asked to leave. Sometimes, children are there as well. And there's some clear decisions that have to be made. What does the entry point look like for help from a male's perspective? Like, is there?
So I guess I'll start by answering this question. There is, like, you have to be mindful that there is violence and it does affect everyone, including males. And depending on the type of violence, you see different demographics. So we saw in one article that verbal violence was largely affected to males. And so, yeah, they definitely are affected by intimate partner violence. It just wasn't our scope. I do think also too, in your regards to your comment on how do they get the support they need in order to stop abusing or using abuse. I think that also stems from the patriarchy and the societal standards that we hold men to right now, both females and males.
Yeah. And if I could just add too, so we talk a little bit in our paper about sort of the community involvement that starts from a young age for men and boys to sort of exactly start dismantling those patriarchal beliefs that they have about themselves and sort of like the power that they should hold over someone that they're in a relationship with. And then briefly we touch on it. We didn't have too much time to research, but definitely really important to think about is sort of the rehabilitation for if you are charged with domestic violence. What's your sort of recovery look like, and how can we sort of help these men reintegrate and become, sort of get rid of those beliefs that help them sort of create that violence in the first place. So really important, for sure.
Not using violence to end violence, I think, is a really important aspect as well. Instead of being violent in the system that's trying to rehabilitate these men, to show them compassion and that they're capable of compassion as well.
And just to reiterate that conditioning when you're younger, because we do observe everything, the people around us. So if we are able to start from a young age, we're able to hopefully dismantle that before it gets to a physical state later on.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Just a question about whether you found out anything from the employment community as to what employers can do to support people that might be experiencing partner violence.
I can just say one quick piece. I know there is things within like government level in Alberta as well, but having things like domestic violence leave to allow women sort of time off work where they're still getting paid and don't have to worry about the financial aspect, or they have to go to work because they need the money. So that's one thing that can definitely be at the employer level, but also would be better integrated at the government level to sort of, again, make that more systematic.
And if I may, I think it's also on society to destigmatize violence against women, because I think we mentioned before that, well, in our paper we did anyways, a lot of these women won't come forward because they're embarrassed to, and they feel like their situation is something that they need to keep to themselves, when in reality is, if we destigmatize everything, it'd be a lot easier to talk about it in the workplace and to eventually get help that way and to prevent it from becoming something lethal.
Okay, well, we've run out of time for questions. Thank you so much again, Bobby, Mackenzie, Anna Maria, and Joanna. So next up, our final team, examining the issue of women, science, technology, and engineering, otherwise known as STEM, and the barriers to a successful future in STEM. We have Asfa Riaz, fourth year info design student, and Shania DaCosta, fourth year info design student.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for giving us this opportunity today to present our research with you all. It's truly an honor and we're very excited to share our findings. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge and express our thanks to those who contributed to our research, including subject matter experts, interview participants, and especially Professor Ben Koons, the Associate Professor and Acting Chair of Information Design at MRU. By openly sharing their experiences and wisdom, it gave us a deeper understanding of the subject and helped shape our research. So let's begin with quick introductions. So my name is Asfa, and I just finished up the last semester of my undergrad degree in communications, majoring in information design. I'm currently based in Calgary, and my passion and focus lies in using design as a means to reveal new ways of thinking in a manner that is inclusive, sustainable, and encourages dialogue and discussion.
My name is Shania, and like James mentioned, I'm also a fourth-year information design student finishing up my last semester. And for me, information design is all about making information understandable and using it to help create change for those who may not have someone to advocate for them. And so today we're going to walk you through our process and the steps that we took before actually visualizing the data. So many science, technology, engineering, and mathematics or STEM fields suffer from an obvious gender gap. And despite growing numbers, women still make up a significantly smaller percentage in STEM programs and workplaces than men. And this issue is heightened when minorities or women of color are considered because they face a completely different spectrum of challenges. And this project takes a system thinking approach to examine this problem. And it revealed that the greatest contributor to this problem is our society and the lack of awareness surrounding this issue. And as disheartening as it is, it also means that change lies directly in our hands.
So this is our How Might We question that we focused on throughout the duration of this project, and it reads, how might we increase the visibility of women of color and foster an environment of inclusivity to encourage women to pursue STEM fields? So the basis of our research lies in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 5, gender equality, was a topic that we decided to ground our research in. And within the vast topic of gender equality, we wanted to highlight and narrow in on an issue that doesn't necessarily get as much attention as it deserves. The other reason that we chose this topic was because we're obviously women of color, so that was a huge deciding factor. Personally, I do a lot of activism work on the side, and it's really brought me to reevaluate my role in the world. So I see design as a means to facilitate change, and so our How Might We question is inspired by that, and by the realization that each of us are capable of facilitating change on an individual and personal level.
So as women, we wanted to encourage others to pursue these fields and feel that they have the necessary support network to be able to succeed and thrive in these workspaces. In our research, we came across the concerning fact that many of these professions do not cater to women, and especially those with families.
So the root of this issue often begins inside of our homes, which in turn goes on to affect our classrooms, post-secondary institutions, and of course, our workplaces. So our goal throughout the research was to raise awareness about this issue by providing a platform for those voices to be amplified and not just speaking for them.
And so as you can see on screen, this graphic of the leaking STEM pipeline shows how an increasing number of students do not end up pursuing STEM careers despite initial interest. And this graphic shows that even though a steady stream of people enter STEM fields, those who stay and graduate from these fields are reduced to a mere trickle. Another aspect to consider is that this graphic takes into account both males and females, while our project focuses mainly on women, especially those of color, thus reducing this already slim number even further. This graph shows there are various situations that can cause people to drop off, and as a result, we wanted stakeholders to shift from contributing to the problem to being part of the solution. And we started our desk research by gathering resources online. We began with creating annotated bibliography, which helped gather data on a larger and more global scale. So we looked at a diverse range of resources, including academic resources, statistics, facts, seminars, and articles.
Then perhaps the most important stage of our research was conducting interviews. So we had the opportunity to conduct 3 subject matter expert interviews, or SME interviews, and they provided us with firsthand experience of women working in their fields. And this really helped guide our research and allowed us to look at its local manifestations. The overarching theme was that there are currently barriers that exist and that everyone does have biases. But the best way to combat them is by being aware of them, taking smaller steps before enacting larger change, and providing an adequate support network for younger women.
And so as part of our ethnographic research, we called on all women who are current university students, as well as graduates in STEM fields. And as you can see on screen, this anonymous survey was conducted over the span of approximately 1 week, and we collected between 10 and 20 responses. The demographic for our survey consisted of current students, which made up 60%, and recent university graduates, which made up 40%. Additionally, 80% of our respondents self-identified as people of color. And among the responses we received, we've also highlighted the 4 main areas where our respondents shared that they had previously experienced discrimination. This includes the workplace at 50%, school and university at 25%, home at 12.5%, and other at 12.5%. The startling realization was that discrimination happens on a daily basis, and in environments that we often consider our safe spaces. So, throughout our research, we learned that girls and women are systematically tracked away from STEM fields throughout their lives, and some of these contributors include our education system, cultural influences, dynamics of power and gender, and the media. And as a result, this creates a multitude of barriers and roadblocks for women studying or working in these fields. And being a woman of color adds on to those barriers, and it presents a completely different spectrum of challenges. So STEM fields remain heavily male-dominated, while women face a lack of opportunities, mentors, and role models. And unfortunately, there are currently more barriers and access points for this problem, and there are a multitude of stakeholders that contribute to it. We wanted our system map to reflect these data points that exist on a political, social, environmental, societal, and personal level. Our system map aims to explore the connections between barriers, access points, and various stakeholders, and it displays the fact that while our society is a current contributor to this problem, it also holds the key to shifting perceptions and tackling this issue head-on.
So while our research revealed findings about barriers and roadblocks, in order to inspire hope, we also chose to create an additional map within the main system map with a look at access points. This map aims to draw attention to the solutions and areas of improvement. This map feeds into the main system map by highlighting how many stakeholders feed into certain access points, and this identifies the most achievable solution that can be implemented on various levels and systems. So for instance, all 11 stakeholders feed into dialogue and discussion, which is the purple line. And this means that this is the most essential and also the most achievable because it's relevant to every stakeholder. The ones that are connected to fewer number of stakeholders, such as providing adequate childcare, which is the very first line, connects to only 4 stakeholders, which implies that it is more challenging and difficult to implement. So the data that generates the system map consists of these 3 elements: barriers, access points, and stakeholders. While barriers is a self-explanatory term, access points was one that we favored over the term solutions. With wicked problems, which are problems in which solutions are not always straightforward, we wanted to emphasize that while we might not find the ultimate solution for this issue, we were still striving to find a door to open to get this conversation going. And that's also how we measured success on our part. We also learned that many of these aspects were in direct contrast to one another. So the data that feeds into the barriers also feeds into the access points. And this reveals opportunities for change by dismantling the very systems that prevent women in STEM from thriving. This is also an example of what Dr. Williams, one of our subject matter experts, mentioned with regard to enacting smaller change before taking bigger steps. By uncovering the parallels between the 3 elements and the direct contrast between barriers and access points, our data revealed achievable and long-term solutions that we can collectively agree to work towards.
And so an example of these interconnected barriers and access points include the following: a lack of awareness, biases and stereotypes, and maternity leave, versus dialogue and discussion, female role models, and providing adequate childcare. Our system map highlights the ability for stakeholders to take active roles in removing barriers and promoting access points for those entering STEM fields. A lot of our data points were deeply intertwined, meaning that if you alter one aspect of the system, it creates waves of change throughout.
So the key findings that emerged throughout the duration of our research was that the issue at hand is rooted deeper than we had previously thought, and it actually exists on a systemic level. We concluded that often the barriers that stop women from pursuing STEM fields can be attributed to structural institutions like workplaces or schools, and biases, both intrinsic and extrinsic. While looking for commonalities among these places, we came to the conclusion that change is not just needed in one place. Rather, to address this issue at the very least, we must shift our ground and transform our way of thinking. This new, sustainable, and inclusive way of looking at the world needs to be implemented across the board.
So what does the future hold for women in STEM? To be honest, we don't really know. We do have hope for significant change to make the world a better place for all, and we know that our work on this project isn't necessarily a cure-all, but we do hope we've at least opened the door to get conversation going, which we acknowledge may be difficult, but it's also very important for progress. We hope that we can change this way of thinking and find a way to support and empower women so they can make positive changes in the world. And with that, we can go ahead and open the floor for any questions.
Great, thank you, Esfa and Shania. Another excellent gender-based analysis of the issue. One that remains stubbornly stuck. It's amazing. So over to judges for questions.
I have a question. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by congratulating you on an excellent presentation, both the written and the verbal. I have a question around the limitation of your study to women of color. And I understand you said that it's the one that resonates most closely with you, and I understand that explanation. But what I'm wondering is, to what extent do you think that your findings are more generally applicable to all women? Do you find that your insights are universal, or they're specific in some way to women of color?
I can take that for Shania. So when we began researching, I mean, originally we had framed the problem to be broader. So we definitely did collect views that pertain to all women. And we did find that there was a global global similarity with this issue. Um, with these problems, when we bring women into the picture, these problems exist. And then when you kind of add on minorities and women of color, those problems and challenges are heightened further. And there are more set of barriers that exist for women of color or for other minorities. So it definitely does apply to all women as well, and then also women of color more specifically.
Yeah, and I think also, if I can just jump in, a lot of our research, one of the most impactful points to me was about childcare and women with families. And that just is not specific to women of color, that's women in general. Because a lot of the systems that we interact with, that they have to deal with, are not catered to women with families. So if they need to take time off or they need maternity leave, it's not welcomed and it's not something that's like readily available for them. So I think that's one point that can apply to like the larger field and not just our narrowed focus.
Thank you.
Cole, I think you had your hand up there.
Hi, great presentation. You talked a little bit about scholarships, and I'm wondering, are there, and if so, what types of supports are available to women who wish to re-enter STEM fields after university or after maternity leave?
You wanna?
Yeah, in our research, what I recall right now is we mostly focused on women who, like young women and girls entering the field. And I don't know if we have any resources for those who are re-entering the field. I think it would be harder for sure, because there's a whole lot of things that you have to consider. I guess I can focus on women entering the field, and that would be at MRU. We have I believe it's an event that encourages women in grade 9 to join the field and kind of attend these workshops and labs just to see what it's like. So from that point of view, it encourages you to join at first.
And also, just to jump in, Dr. Amanda Williams, one of our subject matter experts, kind of spoke to the challenges that mothers face when they want to come back into the STEM stream. And it usually has to do with stereotypes and kind of just these biases that exist around women with children, or that they're not capable of working anymore, or that they shouldn't work anymore, or that they're neglecting their family, etc. So I'm sure there are definitely networks that exist, and there are support groups, but as far as what we researched, we couldn't, I don't believe we kind of looked into that aspect too much, but definitely I'm sure that those areas exist.
And I think now that I'm thinking about it, I'm reminded of what we attended one of Dr. Williams' talks on women in entrepreneurship, and that was mainly focused on like older women or just women in general who were getting into the field. And I think a lot of resources for that, women were doing great in the crowdfunding space because they were able to achieve goals. So their goals were smaller and more realistic. So they under-promised, but they over-delivered compared to men who over-promised and under-delivered. So that's just one area where women were really succeeding and able to thrive.
Thank you very much.
We might have time for a very, very, very quick question. Or comment. Okay, well, Shania and Asfa, just amazing. And to all of you, really remarkable. And I can say this honestly, quite sincerely, any of these 4 presentations would do extremely well at the national level. So just phenomenal grouping of students and presentations. And I really admire as well how you've taken upon yourself to reach out to all kinds of faculty members on campus, including faculty members that are not in your own discipline or wheelhouse. So well done. Sorry, that's my alarm. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a quick break here. We're going to shift gears. The judges are going to go off to a separate chat room and deliberate. And while we do that, we're in a couple minutes, I'm going to introduce our fireside chat guests. I want to make sure, though, that this is a good chance if you haven't had a bio break feel free to take one, and we'll start in about 2 minutes, and I'll introduce Ashley and Jillian. And then in half an hour's time, the judges will return with their verdict.
Right, so just tell the judges I'll meet you all on the other link that was provided shortly.
So I figured this is as good as we can do for a fireside chat without being together in person. Okay, we'll get going on our chat. I want to introduce Jillian and Ashley. Thank you for joining us. Jillian Ma is a Bachelor of Communications Studies graduate of the Information Design program, and Ashley is in her 4th year of a Bachelor of Business Administration, completing a General Management Honors program with a concentration in social innovation. A year ago, Ashley and Jill, alongside Ambrose University behavioral sciences student Matthew Tabarata, finished in 1st place in the MRU Campus Final. Their analysis of the broken system of charity in Canada earned them a spot in the Canadian final, where they finished in the top 6. They went on to compete at the global final hosted by the University of Oxford, which sadly, due to COVID, was a virtual event, as it will be this year. So, Jillian, Ashley, welcome. My first question is, where are you now? What's preoccupying your time?
I can start. So since being in Map the System, I recently started a new position at a company called Help Seeker. We're a B Corp social enterprise that focuses on using data, technology, and systems mapping to improve the impact of the social safety net, and really kind of look at, planning and, how we can improve the social system kind of at that systems level. So not just within a certain sector or not just around a certain issue, but kind of, what's the coordination between them? How are sectors working together? Things like that. So that's what I've been busy doing. Ashley, over to you.
Yeah. For myself, I've been hired on by the Trico Changemaker Studio to help with the nonprofit Resilience Lab, which actually directly correlates to what we were doing in Map the System, where we're looking at the nonprofit sector in Calgary and some of the possible issues there and how we can just make it a bit better and run better for just those people involved.
Cool. So it sounds like you're both in occupations, or at least temporary occupations, that are directly related to some of your work in Map the System. So Jillian, I'm gonna start with you. I'm gonna guess that there may have been a time as an undergrad, especially as an info design student, where you might have wondered whether this whole systems mapping thing was just an exotic academic preoccupation, not something that you might actually use in the real world. Can you comment on that? Just how useful or not systems mapping has been in your work?
You know, such a big focus of the program that I was in, information design, is about making things, and it's like it's doing the research and figuring out how to represent it, and doing that over and over again. So you're always going through these kind of iterations, and the more sketches you make, the more things you write, the more things you design, you get a better understanding of that subject matter. So yes, systems mapping did feel vague and ambiguous, but the reason that I was sort of attracted to it was because, you know, systems mapping, it is an example of information design. You have to go through that process. You have to, you know, think about how you're representing the system and what that will mean and how people will interpret it and what all the different components are. So I think like my education set me up well for that. You know, as we were doing this project, that was exactly it. The more iterations of the systems map we made, the more we learned about the topic, and the more that we wrote, the more that we researched, the more that we learned. So it was going through that process, I think, that's where the value came out for me.
Cool. Ashley, how did Map the System shape your thinking, and how has it influenced your career path?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I've been in social innovation for basically the entire time I've been at Mount Royal. And yeah, so it was a natural kind of step into that. But then I think kind of after that point, I really got a lot of confidence in myself that this was an area that I could do really well in, and that I could contribute and learn how to actually use what I've learned at Mount Royal to make a difference in the world.
You're both taking part in something called Apprenticing with the Problem. Can you tell us a bit about that, and what kind of activities you're hoping to undertake in that?
Yeah, so sorry, Ashley. So the work that we're doing with Apprenticing with the Problem, this is really an extension of the work that we did in Map the System. So in Map the System, we were obviously doing our systems maps, we were writing our reports, we were putting together a video, and that took a really broad look at the issue that we were looking at. What we're doing with the Apprenticing with a Problem funding is still building on that research, but diving more into sort of the historical components of the issue. So in our first research project, we focused a lot on policies and structures and mental models, but we wanted to dive even deeper into that and kind of say, okay, why are those mental models a thing? Why are these policies a thing? And kind of take a historical look at the sector. So we're making a documentary on that, and we're working with the Nonprofit Resilience Lab, which Ashley is working with at her other job as well. You know, to look at those issues and to, you know, validate our findings with real people who are working in the sector, as well as some different experts in the sector, and, you know, tell that story. Let's talk about why, how the sector can do better. Let's talk about what's holding us back, because we can't move forward and create a better system unless we really understand the history and the structures and, you know, all those pieces that are stopping the sector from living up to its full potential.
As you, oh yeah, Ashley, do you have anything to add?
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah,
to
the
that?
only other thing that I would say is, yeah, we just decided to go with a documentary because we wanted it to be able to be easy to understand, because it is a very complex, difficult system that a lot of people get very lost in, and it has a lot of jargon in it. So we wanted to make it easy to understand and have easy access to a lot of different people, just to start people thinking about, like, maybe this isn't the best way to do things, or, you know, is there different ways that we can shift our thinking through that process?
What's your target completion date for the documentary?
We're looking at September, having it done.
Cool. I think you're going to have a huge audience for that. That's very exciting. What do you, I mean, as you dive in deeper to you know, a related topic, as you covered in your Map the System work, and maybe it's either topical or just other general insights. What do you wish you knew when you had participated in Map the System that you know now and you're like, oh, that would have been great to build into it?
I would say, I think one of the biggest things is you get lost very fast and you can go down rabbit holes very, very quickly. And it's all part of that really big, broad system that is affecting, and it's good to look at those avenues, but also like don't get discouraged if you're like going down somewhere and you're like, is that part of the system? Is it not? I've spent like a week researching this. I don't know where it goes. And I think it's really good to like also just seek out guidance from other people and be like, these are my thoughts. How do you interpret this? Like, how do you see it? And talk to those experts in the field.
I'd say the exact same thing. It's like, Map the System was an exercise in seeing how comfortable you could be with being uncomfortable. You know, it was we dealt with such a big topic that was so complex, and like Ashley said, we went down a rabbit hole every evening, every weekend, just, you know, trying to wrangle all of the information that we had. And so, yeah, I think if I could go back in time and tell myself something, it would be ready for that and embrace it, because that's just all part of the learning process as we go through it.
What advice would you have for undergraduates just starting their university journey now? You know, what would you do differently if you were to wind the clock back?
I'm not sure there's too much I would do differently, to be honest with you. I think it's really good to just get involved in campus life and to get to know your professors and talk to them and pick their brains on topics. Yeah, and I think just get to know people and do interdisciplinary work. I think that's also really important, which I think Mount Royal really like focuses in on. But yeah, those would kind of be a lot of my advice. And I'm not sure if I would do anything that different, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. I think I was always, you know, a student that was very, very highly involved in different initiatives and projects and stuff. And I think that was a strength for me. And I'd give that advice to any new student starting is, you know, go do topics outside of your program, outside of your comfort zone. Even though my degree was in information design, some of the most valuable classes that I took were social innovation classes. Some of the most valuable classes were business classes. They were, you know, computer science, environmental science. Those were the ones that really pushed my thinking the most. And I think the ones that gave me the most fun out of my degree.
So that's interesting, because I mean, one of MRU's big value propositions is liberal arts, exposure to disciplines you wouldn't normally think of, or ideas and ways of thinking that you might not normally have access to. Can you comment any further on that piece, the liberal arts general education piece?
When I was at Mount Royal, so many students resented that. But I don't think it's something to be resented. I think it's something that should be embraced. Like I really enjoyed my general education classes, and there's a lot to be learned from them. And just because it's not something that you choose to do necessarily doesn't mean that it's something that you can't get value out of. I got tons of value out of my general education.
Yeah, I would say I was the same. I think it's contributed a lot to like my learning, and especially when thinking about like systems thinking and looking at complex issues, normally they're all interconnected. So it's good to have that broad base of what does the system look like in different places and how are people thinking about it. So yeah, I really valued a lot of my gen eds.
Great. Well, I'm going to stop the fireplace, as lovely as it is, because I want to be able to see the chat room and see and encourage if anyone has any questions or comments for Jill or Ashley. And also, I'll keep my eye on the chat room to see if the judges, when the judges are done deliberating. So Emma agrees gen eds don't get enough credit. I invite any participant, any audience member to throw a question out to Jill or Ashley or both.
I have a question. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Ashley and Jillian. I was just curious of what was the most challenging part of your journey throughout the entire Map the System project.
I won't speak for Ashley. I think the hardest part for me is that getting such a complex system down into a 5-minute video and a very short report. Like the system we looked at was super complex. There's tons of components, and so you know, you have to pick and choose a little bit what the most important parts are. You know, it's picking the most important parts that tell the most powerful story without losing the meaning and losing the sense, really losing the interesting, complex sense of what the system is. So that was my biggest challenge is, okay, we have all this information. How do we get it down into something that's digestible for the judges? How do we get it down into something that's digestible for the audience where they can still understand how nuanced of a problem it really is?
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. I think the other thing is also it's quite anxiety inducing at times to, you know, present to, you know, be representing the school even, I think was quite stressful at times of like, okay, well, like every team's gone through. So like we need to make sure that we are of that same quality and caliber. But yeah, also just getting, I think, everything down on the actual like system side of things was definitely very difficult. We had to oftentimes figure out what was the most important to tell the complexity of the story and yeah, what people would really resonate with.
And that Ashley, you know, after you knew that you were kind of the first place team on campus, you had a chance, there's a window there to adjust everything before you resubmit to the national final. What were some of those adjustments that you made, either at the national one or onto the global one?
Yeah, going from the campus to national, or you know what, you just asked Ashley that question and I just jumped in and interrupted her.
No, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, going from the campus to the national level, what we definitely needed was, you know, a bit more of a national focus. So that meant talking to more people who had an understanding not just of the Calgary and the Albertan system, but of the Canadian system as a whole. So there was that piece that we had to think about. And then going from nationals to globals, you know, we really wrote our first report based on the assumption that we were talking to a Canadian audience. Well, we weren't talking to a Canadian audience anymore. So they didn't have a sense of, you know, what the sector landscape is like. They didn't have a sense of kind of how charity works in Canada or its relationship with the government. So we definitely had to do some level setting there, like rather than just jumping in and talking about things, we really had to kind of step back and say, hey, this is the history of it. This is how the system came to be, and walk the audience through that a little bit more.
Ashley, anything to add on that? Can you chat about your interviews?
Yeah, we really picked up a lot of interviews last minute when we went kind of into the nationals. We were like, okay, so now, yeah, having a national like focus, we were like, we need to understand the system, and we had a pretty small window, so it was kind of grinding it out for a solid week and really just playing with people to give us interviews, which worked kind of in our favor because everyone was at home because we're in the middle of a pandemic. So that kind of worked out. So we were able to talk to people a lot broader and just online. So that was actually quite nice and worked in our favor. But yeah, no, I think it was a big step going from each level. But I also think that, you know, we were very well like supported and had other people kind of being like, oh, maybe talk to this person and here's some advice to go in this direction and stuff. And I think that helped a lot as well.
So I'm just putting into the chat room your the link to your presentation and materials. So if anyone wants to follow up, well worth doing. Reading, watching, and so on. Other questions, feel free to put them in the chat room. You don't have to unmute yourself if you don't want. You can just write them in. So while others are thinking about it, let me throw another one out to you. Just on the topic you chose, you really interrogated the idea of charity, the mental models we have around charity, the regulatory environment, the public policy environment, the structures, and so on. What would success look like for you? And you can be as general or as specific as you want. I mean, what would you hope would be different, say in 10 years' time, than is the case now on any of those fronts, whether it's regulation or how Canadians think about charity, or to take your pick? What would you wish would change or hope to change?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, so I'll let Ashley go first.
Okay, sounds good. I think I also have a lot of thoughts on that. I think one of my biggest ones, though, I think is just how we think about charity and, how we perceive a lot of things. A lot of times when people donate, they want their money to go directly to the person in need, instead of thinking about like, how could, if we had a better system and if we funded that system better, how could that actually help more people versus those dollars going directly to that person instead of into staffing or into any system. I think that'd be one of the main things that I'd like to see. I think there's also needs to be some policy changes as well. But I think if we get our heads wrapped around really what charity is trying to do and how we can play a part in the system, I think we can really then make those policies active as well.
Jill.
And I think that, we put a lot of responsibility on charities in the nonprofit sector. Unfortunately, they're the ones that kind of have to clean up after a lot of inefficiencies in the system. They're the ones that have to deal with the most vulnerable people. But at the same time, as it stands, they're not well equipped to do that work. Some of that's because of how rigid funding is. Some of that's just about, expectations. People want short-term, quick results rather than solving the issues at their core. So I don't know what the solution is, but what I would like to see as sort of an ideal state is where, if we're going to put that responsibility on the charity system, let's equip them to do that. Let's make sure that they have the flexibility to innovate. Let's make sure that we're giving them the patience and the time and the resources to, think about how to solve issues in the long term, think about how to solve issues at their root rather than just dealing with the symptoms of problems, and put the focus back on who's using the system. So much of the system is designed around, what's easy for funders or what's easy for organizations. Like let's really take a step back and say, okay, if we're serving a certain population, let's listen to them and let's make sure that that system is serving them in the way that they want to be served.
That's great. There's a great question from Emma. Do you have any advice for getting jobs related to the field of social innovation? How did you end up where you are now?
My advice, I'm actually like the worst example of this, because people always will talk about like, make sure you have a portfolio and make sure you have resumes. I got my current position through personal connections through James actually, and that's how I've gotten actually all of my past jobs over the past 4 or 5 years probably. So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in job searching, but what I do know is that networking works and relationship building works, and working with people, making sure that you can collaborate with them, listening to experts, just meeting as many people as you possibly can. That's what's worked for me. So
yeah, I would say it's kind of been the same for me as well. I would also add, do stuff like this. This helps to like get your name out there and network with people within the field. And then you can start to talk to them about interests. Along with another great way is to use LinkedIn and just start to connect to people and just see if they want to have a coffee or something. You don't need to get anything specific out of it. Just get to know people and talk to them about what you're interested in and just see where things go as well.
So advice for introverts, if the thought of networking scares the bejesus out of you, how do you, like, what's your advice for breaking through that?
First things for introverts, take advantage of this COVID pandemic and the fact that we're all online and you can do it in the comfort of your own home. I'm an introvert myself, and it's definitely much easier to do these things online, even if it's just, you know, having a Zoom chat or having a quick text with somebody. That's my one thing that you could do. What else for introverts? I think, you know, there's always a little bit of a fear when you reach out to strangers to talk to them about different topics, but think of it as, you know, something that's good for yourself. You're not just there to bother them, but you're there to, you know, push your personal learning. You're there to push your personal growth. And if you can make it valuable for them in some way too, say, hey, I'm working on this, but I think that I have some thoughts that you could benefit from, or I think that I have some ideas that I could bring to the table to you, then it makes it a little bit more of a two-way conversation, and you don't necessarily have that same guilt that you might if you're just reaching out of nowhere.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'm not really an introvert. But I do think the other thing to keep in mind is when you are reaching out to people is most people do want to talk to people that are coming up in their field. They're excited to hear new perspectives as well. So I think you definitely can add value, even if you don't know maybe exactly what they're researching or what they do, but you might be able to just add value by being a young voice to listen to and be like, oh, what are young people doing these days that are in this field or interested in this field? What are they learning? I think that just adds value in itself.
Great. So we know that the judges are going to be here in about 2 minutes. Other final questions for Jillian or Ashley? I have one just about storytelling and narrative. You know, we often say half the challenge of Map the System is understanding systems mapping and understanding your issue at depth. But half of it really is telling that story in a way that's compelling and understandable and connects with a broader audience, including a public audience. What are some of the tips, tricks, or insights you have on that front?
One of them is, you know, break it down. You can't go in and show everything at once. You have to sort of build it up, put it into pieces, and then tell the story that way. The way that you sequence information too, so where you start versus, you know, how you order that information, how you tell it, and, you know, where you get to in the end. That's another piece. I would say don't be afraid of using different media. Like we used videos, we used several different diagrams, we used visuals, we used text, we used voiceovers. So there, you know, having that kind of combination of media can help it resonate with people in different ways. And like testing it with people, you know, if you're working on a story, go put it in front of somebody, say, does this make sense? If I tell you this story, you know, what do you get out of it? And then work through it, go through those iterations, go through those drafts. And then, you know, it's going through that process. Again, I keep talking about process, but there is a process of making and representing and doing it over and over and trying things out. That's really great for learning, and it almost always results in a better product. And in this case, it would be a better story about your system.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that we did as well is like we decided to use a boat metaphor because we're like, everyone knows what a sinking boat is, I'm pretty sure. So we just used that in a way to make the system make sense to anyone, no matter if you knew the regulations, no matter if you understood things or not, because you had already that grounding information. And that's kind of what we ended up grounding our like presentation in, is like the charity as a boat. And I think that's also like a good way to sometimes go to make sure if it's really complicated and really hard to like understand, that's an easy way to just make it easier for everyone.
one of the things that I'm recalling now is COVID hit just before the Map the System campus final kind of came to happen. So I think like with maybe 2 weeks left in the deadline, that was when campus shut down and social distancing measures were put in place. And so there was a lot of scrambling at the time, hand-wringing over, do we even cancel the competition, go ahead with it? So it like, kudos to you for making a whole bunch of adjustments, but one of the really important ones is we decided to experiment last year with a video format in lieu of a live presentation. And it was a 5-minute video at that. So it put some really difficult constraints on your ability to tell a story. And we've gone back to the previous format this year. But I just want to say you did such an amazing job of that video. If for those who are kind of on this call, it's worth just taking the 5 minutes, go to the mapthesystem.ca/2020 site, scroll down to Ashley and Jillian's presentation and watch the 5-minute video. It's really worthwhile because it's wonderfully crafted, and that boating metaphor was perfect. Any last words of wisdom?
I don't know. I would say just enjoy the experience. I think, you don't get a lot of opportunities where you get this kind of mentorship and to put your thoughts out there and to have other people be experts and, talk to them and get their expertise as well. I think this is a really unique opportunity. So I think just enjoy it. And I think everyone's done really well.
Yeah. Same thing for me. Use the opportunity, use the mentorship, use the I'm a student and I just want to learn excuse. That's one of the best excuses that you have. So take advantage of that because there's so many great people around you that you can learn from. So like take advantage of that, learn all you can.
Well, Jill and Ashley, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and learnings and reflections with us. Hugely valuable, and it's been such a pleasure over this past year just to get to know you better and to see the kinds of things you're diving into. It's really, really cool to see how your career is unfolding. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We really appreciate it.
So I see the judges are back. Welcome back. Thanks again to all the hard work all of the teams have put in. And no matter which team moves forward, again, you've all demonstrated just amazing insight into some really important public issues. We've enhanced, I think, all of our awareness and understanding and depth of our knowledge. And, you've shown just remarkable tenacity, again, sticking with the challenge in such an amazingly challenging year with unparalleled adversity. So know that this experience, regardless of what happens here, will serve you well as you embark on your career, deepen your learning, or move on to another university and another program or graduate program. I want to thank as well the judges, George, Yasmin, Nicole, and Steve, for donating your time and outstanding feedback. And as a small token of our gratitude, each of you will receive a virtual gift card from Canada Helps to donate to a charity of your choosing. So the winning team, just a reminder, will move forward to the Canadian semifinals, which are on May 5th. And then there will be a public Canadian final on May 7th. So I'll now ask one of the judges to summarize their deliberations and to announce the winner.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much. All the teams did an excellent job at their research, the systems map, lots to be learned there. So thank you very much for all the preparation that went into that. One group we had a chance to deliberate, and one group that stood out for us was the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in care. So they are winning. They are the winner. There's, for many reasons. One of the things that really stood out is, this group did their due diligence, and they reached out to the community to collect knowledge from those in the community. I was really excited to see Grandmother Doreen Spence interviewed. I know she's part of Mount Royal. as well as, to just describe the complexity of the systems and lived experience there. So terrific. And another thing that stood up is just I just wanted to point out the way that it was opened by that child perspective, just a really neat way to open a story and shed light to the complexity and this, this problem. So again, thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you, Nicole. That's a difficult thing to do. So thank you and congratulations to the winning team and to all of the outstanding students. And just another huge shout out again to Ashley Metz for making this whole event possible and the broader competition run so smoothly amid the chaos. I encourage you all to sign up.
I'm going to interject as well. James has not gotten the proper accreditation as well. James behind the scenes has helped me just as much in preparing the teams and helping to connect the teams with subject matter experts when necessary. So thank you very much, James, as well for all your hard work.
Thanks, Ashley. And just a shout out to Latasha Kaffrobe and Amy Rintoul, who are managing in parallel the Map the System Canada program, and will be of course delivering a spectacular national final, which I encourage you all to sign up for and attend in May. So thanks to everyone. Keep well, stay safe, and enjoy this spring. This has been Map the System 2021.